back to another episode of the Language Lounge, and my name is Michelle Ola, and I am excited to talk about, I don't know, should we say the word already?
Let's start
right out of the gates. We're going to talk about grammar. So Mike Travers is here with me today, and I saw some of the videos that you did about different models, kind of modern models of teaching grammar. And they just were I'm so impressed. So we're going to definitely put those in the show notes, but I'm really excited to talk with you today about the G word. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us why this is something that is important to you, something that you want to talk about, and what we're going to kind of talk about today.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Travers. I'm a Spanish teacher in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And I've been teaching for 8 years now. And I'm somebody that definitely doesn't do well with free time, hence all the books that are behind me and the things that I'm constantly doing. You can always find me out there at MAFLA conferences, NECTFL, ACTFL. I'm always somewhere. I just got to stay on the move, got to be doing something.
Yeah, I understand.
But yeah, we're here to talk about my favorite thing, which is the thing that like all teachers want to talk about, but no one wants to talk about. I love that we're calling it the G word, like grammar. It's okay, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's so funny. Like, whenever I talk to people about grammar, it's kind of this bad word every once in a while. People look around the room, they're like, can he say that? Should he be allowed to?
Shouldn't we call it language structures? Or, which is nothing wrong with that, but
right.
There's something about naming it, right?
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Because for a lot of us, that's what we fell in love with it, right? We fell in love with the verb charts. We fell in love with just conjugating until our heart's sung, right? And like the way I like to think of it is we're not getting a divorce from grammar. We're just redefining our relationship with it. We're just seeing how it kind of fits in, you know?
I like that. That is a great way to put it, because obviously if we're communicating, we can't be making up our own sort of grammar rules and have our own little language. There are things that help communication and hurt communication, right? At some level, grammar does matter. We're not saying it's not important, but reimagining how we look at it in our relationship with it. I really love that. So first of all, why do we have to reimagine this relationship with grammar, do you think?
So it comes out of those ACTFL core practices to start with, right? So those ideas that for me kind of define when somebody says, what does it mean when you teach for proficiency? Like I always pull up that graphic. But basically it's just because the way we approach units now, the way we approach our teaching is just what are we getting our kids to say? What are we getting our kids to do with language? And how do we use grammar to support that? Versus before you used to ask a teacher like, hey, what's the next unit you're teaching? Oh, I'm teaching the preterite unit. And that would be the unit, right? There might be some vocab, there might be a reading or some culture thrown in there. But now it's like, no, I'm going to be teaching a unit on travel. And the grammar I'm going to use is past tense to talk about what I did on that vacation. So it's kind of like the support that lets you talk about actual real people things, because nobody goes around talking about the preterite except for us.
Right? Isn't that the truth? That is funny. In one of my presentations I do about grammar and context and as a concept, which we can unpack that. That's like a mouthful, right?
Right.
But in one of those, there's, those pictures where one person sees one thing, like an old lady, and one person sees, something else, an old man. And we always talk about grammar being the same way. Once you think you know what it is, it's hard to look at it a different way. But really, that's all we're doing. We're just looking at it differently. We're not throwing it out. We're just kind of refocusing it in the communicative sort of approach is how I like to explain it too, right? So talk to us. So let's unpack that core concept. So teaching grammar as a concept and used in context. So what does that mean?
So sneakily on the ACTFL website, they actually describe it quite well. But I would love for that to be like as public as humanly
bigger,
possible, right? Let's get that billboard size,
right?
But basically, what it kind of comes down to is teachers choosing the grammar that matches their communicative goals. And my favorite word out of that is actually choosing. Like for so long, it was this is the next grammar. This is the thing that shows up next. But we're in control. We're smarter. We know what we're doing. Like we know to choose. This is the grammar I need in order to do this thing. Is basically like what they're trying to get at, or at least one part of it.
Mm-hmm.
there's other parts to it too, where like we're thinking about, we used to focus so much on the forms and how to form and how to make those, when in reality, we've kind of realized what's going on in the kid's head. They don't see charts. They see charts maybe in class, but what they're seeing is they're trying to retrieve just the meaning of the word. Like I've never met a kid that's ever been like, all right, I want to say I go out. So is that a go verb? Okay. So I'm going to go to like, I've never met somebody else.
I feel like I got stuck in that little form, as a young language learner. And then you do get stuck in your head and you don't actually get any language out. And I think to me, that is another reason why it's so important, is that you get so stuck with like, make sure I say the right ending on this verb, instead of like, well, if I don't, what does that mean? Is it a different, what's the consequences of that? Right. And really thinking about it, right. As opposed to just retrieving all of that chart just to try and say, I'm going to the movie tonight. Do you want to come or whatever? So
yeah, like that's basically what it is. It's like that was such a big shift for me, was once I kind of started to think of grammar as vocabulary, and like that's what they're kind of building up in their heads. Because they're not asking how do you conjugate this verb. They're asking how do you say this? Mm-hmm. How do you say that? And that's kind of like, honestly that's kind of the biggest piece too of this grammar as a concept in context, is like, think of the meaning of the words. The forms will come. We got to show them the forms. They'll get there. Mm-hmm. But what do those words actually mean? Because otherwise, it's just a pretty chart.
Yeah, and I love that making that connection. Once you understand that this word means I am going, or whatever our example might be, then you can start thinking about, oh, well, I wonder if he says it's like a little bit different. Oh, that's interesting. And now you can start making connections, and the brain can start making meaning out of all of these things. And, oh, if I did something yesterday, it's a different word. Okay, that's interesting too, right? I have to think about things. But none of that comes until they have some of that language that they can, kind of retrieve without having to memorize a whole.
Exactly. And experimenting around with the language, right? Letting them be wrong a little bit, see what happens, and intervene as needed. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And I think just that the part that always got me was that concept, teaching it as a concept. I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, I really had to think about that. But just, we forget that a concept of something in the past is something different than a concept of something that's happening now or in the future, right? Like those are different concepts of, different ideas to kind of grasp, and that they're different. I can't say the same, verb for all three of those things, right? So
exactly. And that's the hardest part to explain to people, because it sounds so fancy schmancy. You're like, as a concept.
Right.
And it's one of those things that like the more examples you see and the more you talk like a person, the more you realize that this is what it looks like for us as a real people.
Yeah, exactly. So I love that. And then that other important part is that context part. And I hope, gone are those days of just those. I mean, I still think I have my verb chart master conjugation thing that by the time I got out of Spanish 4 had like however many, millions of tenses across, and every verb I knew down, and we'd fill them out constantly and all those things. I didn't know what half those words meant. I definitely didn't know when to use one versus the other at that point, but I knew every ending in that box, right? And, that's what we mean by out of context. It wasn't connected to anything, any meaning in my head. It was just the chart. The chart, right? The chart is the chart, right?
And the context too of like the units and stuff. I've had some fun units in my beginning days with proficiency where I've had what I call grammar mismatches, where I just did the next grammar, but I was like, oh, what a cool thematic unit we have. And I ended up with these strange units of things that I never could have imagined in my life. Like we accidentally did one where we were doing a unit on professions. Yeah, it was.
I love that. Like that was accidentally. I had no control. I don't know what happened here.
We all look back on it and we all just have a good laugh about it now. But it was a scene, let me tell you, because we did a unit on professions. And like, if you were to choose, like going back, if I could choose, I think I know what I would choose now, probably future. But the imperfect is what came next. So the whole unit was based around what I used to want to be when I was younger.
That's a lot. Yeah.
Oh, that's a lesson you learn real quick.
Right. Oh, that is great. So so we kind of get that idea of why, right? So not only like is it more meaningful for, everybody but the future language teachers that are sitting in our classroom, right? They want to talk, they want to know how to say things, Um that's one part. And the research says, we know a lot more than we used to know.
Right.
When we didn't know as much, when I didn't know as much, I taught a certain way. And as I learn more, right, I try and kind of move forward. And so what are let's like dig into some strategies,
Yeah.
because there are different models. There's not just one way to do this, which I like that. And depending on the circumstance, depending on your teaching methodology or style or whatever, you can approach this in a number of different ways, right? So what's the first one you kind of like to talk about?
So I'm going to go off book because normally I would say
Oh,
pace, right? But I feel like
okay.
enough pace has been out there for people that don't know it. They should definitely check it out, and I'll give you some stuff, Michelle, to throw in the show notes.
Yes.
But
I think
pace
that
kind
is
of
the most
overwhelms
well
people.
known. Yeah.
Yeah, it's super well known, right? But and if you don't know, there's tons of stuff to help you like kind of learn
Yes.
about it, right? But it can be a little overwhelming to people at first because it's much more structured. It's much more like it's very different than kind of what we're used to. One that I really like that I don't think is used as much. One of the first ones, it's in the same discovery realm as
Mm-hmm.
pace, is called concept attainment.
Yeah,
And
and talk about that discovery part of that first, because a lot of these do fall under that kind of flipped approach to the students being the ones that are, discovering, observing patterns, and we're not standing there telling all this stuff anymore, right? We're kind of
right.
letting them do it. So there's a couple models that fall under this. So I love concept attainment. So tell us this. And this is one, just as a note, like I heard about this from my ELA teachers and my ELLs and the ESOL teachers. Like this is something done in general education quite a bit, that we don't necessarily haven't taken as much advantage of, I don't think. So let's dig in. Concept attainment. Tell us what that is and how to do it.
Yeah. So it's part of like we were saying, that discovery piece. It's my question that I've been asking a lot lately is like, who's doing the heavy lifting? And we know that like when kids do the majority of the work up front, it kind of sticks a little bit better. That experience of like working through it, getting stuff wrong, getting stuff right, figuring out patterns on their own. It's part of it's kind of reminds me of that graphic. You ever see that graphic that says like you remember this percentage of what you're told, and it kind
Yep.
of falls in that same sort of idea. So concept attainment works really well. Let's say you have like a grammar point where it's like this versus this, like so it's really, really clear sort of rule. So I think of things like, for example, in Spanish, you would have like subjunctive of doubt, where it's like there's certain expressions that use subjunctive, certain ones that use present tense. Or if you had, for example, like masculine versus feminine objects, right? You have those sort of like clear, it's this or it's that. So what the teacher could do is they could kind of pre-plan. It's a really quick lesson, and kids are really engaged through this relatively quick lesson where you kind of prepare some slides ahead of time. And you tell kids up front, you say, all right, so what I'm going to do is we're going to have two columns. One on your paper, you have yeses and you have nos. You don't know what they're called. We're just going to call them yeses and nos. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of some yeses. And as I say them, I just want you to jot them down in the chart. Jot them down in your notes as like those are yeses. I'm going to show you a couple of nos. Let's make sure we jot those down. And then it's going to be on you. I want you to kind of work with your partner, see what you can figure out as you see them. So the first one, they might start out by seeing like, I don't think that. And then they might see, I doubt that. And then the next one might be, I think that. So I'm flat out telling them like, okay, that was a no. That one was a no. That one was a yes. And then we keep going through, and then it's on them. And they see like, okay, it's true that. And by the end, what they're doing is they're processing without even really knowing. They're kind of processing for meaning and putting things into categories by finding those sort of patterns where they're saying like, oh, I'm noticing like those tend to be like no's. Those tend to be really negative, right? And so at the end, you end up with this chart, which realistically, I could have just given them that chart. I could have given them that same exact chart. But now they're the ones that have processed all of that information. And what I tell them to do is I say, okay, let's cross out the words yes and no. What would you call them? Because I've never had a class actually say like, oh, this is the doubt section, right?
right. But
Because
does it
that's teacher
matter,
words.
right. So what are some ways that they've like? Can you remember what they called them?
They tend to call them just the positives and the negatives, which totally works for me. Like that's exactly, they get the idea of what I want them to be able to do, right? And so then from there we can easily kind of jump into like just some usage, right? We can go whatever the context is of what I'm doing, I'm going to put it back into that unit. So for example, this one takes place, I believe, I remember when I do it usually is like during our physical health unit. So then we kind of put it into place where it's like, okay, based on what we just learned about, for example, the Mediterranean diet, what could you say about these sort of things? I think this, I don't think that this is important, those sorts of things.
I love that. And like you said, I think this one works best. You do have to have, like, you can't have a maybe, like, or sometimes this, but not this, because that does cloud up and they can't see those very distinct sort of patterns.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love that. I've seen concept attainment used in vocabulary as well, in different groups of different types of words and things like that as well. And so it's a very useful and, like you said, very easy tool with, whether it's images or those words and phrases that they do to find those patterns.
Yeah. And I like to think of that one as like the intro, right? Where it's like, all right, I heard about this thing, like, and I want to backtrack too and say judgment free zone, as I like to call it, where it's like you look back and you're like, oh, I used to do this, right? Maybe if you're in that spot where you're saying like, I've been hearing about this discovery situation, I've been hearing the grammar like different ways. I love to send this as like the first one to try. Like jumping into a pace lesson might not be for you right away, but saying like, okay, let me see what it looks like and what it feels like as the teacher to see when kids are discovering those sorts of things. Because it's definitely a different vibe in the class. And it's definitely a vibe you have to kind of like set up for kids, because I think so often they're so used to just being told like, here's the answer, like go do it, versus like, hey, I want you to do it because I trust that you can figure this out.
Yeah, I think that's the other interesting thing about grammar, and sometimes it's the kids that are saying, yeah, but just tell me the rule, right? Just tell me what the pattern is or what that is, because that, sometimes it's easier. They're not having to think as hard. They're not having to process and make meaning. And, sometimes that's what might be pushing back a little bit on too. But I think that it's so engaging when you do sort of try and look at it differently and try these different approaches. They don't even know they're learning grammar, and at the end they do come up with the rule. They do come up with that. You co-create it or they come up with it, however that works. It's not like we're hiding rules and never telling them like this is actually the rule. It's just we're not doing it up front and turning them off before they even get too far,
and we're putting it in words that they like. I always like to call it kind of human speak, because I think sometimes as teachers we say subjunctive with doubt versus like the kids would just call it positives and negatives. Like it's like you can hear what they are going to call that.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's fantastic. So, well, good. Any other tips if somebody's going to try using concept attainment in the classroom, or other grammar topics or things that you've used it with a lot of success? I know mostly you've got Spanish as your common language that you're doing, but there's others.
Yeah. Like off the top of my head, I know that like in terms of like, definite versus indefinite articles, you could do things with like arrows, right? You can kind of have them so that they see that difference. Preterite versus imperfect or passé composé imparfait expressions, like yeses and nos. What do you notice about all of these? There's repetition behind these versus these are more specific. I'm trying to think of a couple of it. I know on my blog I wrote a list at one point. I had the brain space one day in my life where I wrote all that down.
That's great. Well, we'll definitely include that in the show notes so that people can have that concrete sort of list as well. So let's say a teacher kind of dips their toes in a little bit and tries concept attainment. They're like, oh, okay, this isn't so bad. Let's try let's try another strategy. Or concept attainment doesn't really work very well with this one because maybe it's too complicated or something. What's another idea or another type of model that you use in your classroom?
Yeah. So if we think of like I like to think of it as like we're increasing in terms of like slight difficulty from the teacher end or slight more planning, right? So like the next step up for me, I think of a dictogloss.
Ooh.
I love doing those. They're like kind of
And
my
that's
new
not
thing.
something I've ever done. So tell me more. I love
Yeah.
it. So this is great. So tell me more. Dictogloss.
So a dictogloss is kind of like, remember, like, you ever do dictations before? Like back, like,
Hmm.
I know French
Back in the
teachers,
day, right?
right? Way back. No, like French teachers love their dictations. They're the dictées. I remember doing so many of those when I was learning French, right? And so there's a lot of interesting value like behind dictations themselves, but what they always lacked was what we were kind of talking about before, the purpose. That's just like a language
Mhm.
practice. But it's like, why am I listening to this random sentence about this random person, right? So a dictogloss kind of is a way of kind of making it a little bit more almost gamified, and I'm going to say almost, right?
Mhm.
But it's a way of kind of making it a little bit more gamified and a way of adding meaning of why you're actually listening to these sentences. So it starts out, the teacher writes their little script, not the same length as like what a normal dictation would be. It's like 2 sentences for a novice, 3 to 4 maybe for an intermediate level learner. And within that, you have whatever grammar pattern you're trying to do. So like, let's take like double verbs, for example, right? So you have that in there. You're like, okay, you should do this, you should do that, right? Those sorts of verbs. And so you plan that out ahead of time. You give some sort of scenario. I like to make my scenarios related to Snapchat, and I'll explain why in a second because it kind of relates to this. So I
Okay.
have this sort of script planned, and I tell kids, all right, here's your scenario. Let's say so and so sent you a Snapchat. You're going to listen to it once, but you can't write anything down. You're just going to listen to it. So me as a teacher, I'm just going to read whatever my script is. After I finish reading, that's when I tell kids, pick up your pencil and I want you to reconstruct everything you remember from what I just read. So that's why it's important to only do like 2 sentences up to 4, maybe for an intermediate, because that's a lot to
Yeah.
try to keep in the brain. So then they work by themselves real quick and they're like really rapidly writing stuff down. And then I say, turn to your partner. I want you to work together to kind of co-construct what do you have, where are your blanks, leave some stuff that way. And then I say, okay, pencils down. Just like with a Snapchat, you can press replay. You get 1 replay, and then that person gets the notification about it. But so we're gonna press replay. You get 1 more chance. Now you're gonna listen again, and your goal now is you're reading what you already have. So you're kind of monitoring to see, okay, what did I get right, and you're listening for those pieces that you're missing. Again, I read. Pick up your pencil. Work by yourself, then work with your partner, fill in all those sorts of blanks. I'll project to the real one, like what it actually looks like. And the piece that's important there is to talk about like, okay, like, so what pieces were hard? Where did you kind of realize you had the biggest mistakes? And so when I do this, like with double verbs, right, I always end up hearing, well, I just left the second verb. I made that a yo form, just like the first verb. And so we can kind of bring up, oh, think about what this would actually mean, right? I want to do this thing, or I'm able to, or those sorts of, we're talking about meaning behind that. I might do it again. And then there's a piece that kind of follows up afterwards where it says, okay, based on everything you just, you were just doing those sort of dictations, write a response to that using that new grammar. So for example, with the double verbs one, it might be like, okay, so-and-so's mom gave them a whole bunch of recommendations of what they should do on their first day of school. And I usually like to make it like super ridiculous where it's like, sit front row, raise your hand as much as possible, like things that they ain't gonna do. So then I say, okay, if you were to write a response to this person, what do you actually recommend doing? And so then I'm going to point back to like, notice how she's set up hers, where it was like, I recommend to do this. You should do this, right? And so we're able to kind of put it immediately into context of like the context of what they were just writing about and kind of processing for meaning and using that new grammar as soon as possible.
That's fantastic. What I like about that is it really sounds fun, first of all. I mean,
Oh,
it
you
sounds
should
like,
see them when they're
right?
like
It sounds like a game or a puzzle, and as opposed to this grammar lecture or PowerPoint and all of that. So I mean, it does sound like it just generates a lot of interest, first of all. And I also think like we talk like in English, I say what I say, and do I know why I say what I say? And so I like that idea of like they hear it, they write it, they understand it, and then they kind of afterwards go, "Huh, well that's interesting. Let's kind of think about it a little bit deeper." And it's a great hook, I think, to get them really thinking about some of these concepts. So
Yeah, and it works well for introducing new concepts and reinforcing old concepts, because it's good to kind of like, for example, I think of like adjective agreement, one of those things that just never really sticks right away. And so like, I'll do that with my level 3 students, and I'll
yeah,
be like, did you notice something? Oh, you happen every time, you never once changed the ending of that adjective. That's good feedback for you. And I'll tell them like, that's like, take a reflection moment and just kind of remember that, like as you're writing, that's just something that you might want to keep an eye on as you're going through this.
that's awesome. And I know you have a great video on YouTube that talks about this and kind of shows this dictogloss as well. So, it's hard to get just on a podcast, and people might be driving and they're listening and they're like, oh, that's great. But, now how do you do that again? So there is going to be that follow-up information in the show notes. And I really do appreciate you doing those videos were really great. So,
Oh, thank you.
so what do you say next then? Okay. So now we're really rolling. We've got 2 different options that we can do with students. And I think that's the other thing. Sometimes, and again, I like the PACE model. It's highly structured, but I do think that can get repetitive. If you're doing that with every, grammar kind of topic that you're introducing, I think it's good to mix things up and to have different ways that you can access that kind of.
Yeah, because we want to like, we want them to know kind of, the general scheme of like how language class works, but like we want to throw a curveball every once in a while. And if we're always doing PACE and everything is discoverable, eventually they figure out that there's a co-construction, and they're gonna eventually like. So you want to keep the novelty with it. Like when it comes to like I like to try to vary it up as much as possible. So in like a year 3 course, I think I do 2 PACE lessons, maybe 3 in a year. So it's good to like you're saying, it's really good to have like, I like to think of it as like my toolkit, where it's like, all right, what can I go to? What can I pick from? What matches?
And again, there's nothing wrong. Sometimes you need a good old fashioned, like, let's really look at the accuracy of, depending on the proficiency level they're at. Sometimes a direct grammar lesson is appropriate. Explicit grammar content might be appropriate at a certain level of proficiency when they really are focusing on accuracy, more so than acquiring kind of those, those communication skills and things. So, we're not saying you can never top down teach grammar. There's no nevers here, right? Or always.
Exactly.
So we're just kind of, introducing some other ideas and other ways to
learn. Right. It's that idea of just redefining, right?
That redefining that relationship. I like that.
And you just want to think about like the initial exposure to it, right? You want to have them as invested as possible. And I think of by the time the kids get to like those upper level like grammar courses, I mean, they've gotten a lot of different input. They've probably been exposed to certain grammar points. Like, so I think like I wouldn't do a PACE lesson to discover certain things that they've been doing for years. There's not much to discover at that point. And then, like you're saying, it's okay to kind of insert, because what ACTFL says, which I really appreciate them saying, is that learners should have opportunities for implicit and explicit grammar. Like they need a little bit of both. And I love that idea of like, not putting all your eggs in one basket, where it's like, I am only implicit all of the time, I am only explicit all of the time, right? I love living in the middle of that, because it gives you as the teacher so much to choose from.
Absolutely. And it allows you to meet the needs of the students that you have and make, like you said, professional judgment of what they need and when they need it, right? And the more options that we have, the better we're able to meet those needs. So tell me the next step then. What did this last one be? Because I think we probably aren't going to talk about PACE. Right? Is there one more? I think
there's definitely one more.
I'm super excited about.
And this is the one that I definitely recommend visuals for people to know.
Good. So we'll have to definitely put the video. We'll put the video to this one in the chat so they can actually see it. But hopefully, we'll try and be very visual when we're speaking.
We'll try to channel it, right?
Right. Exactly.
So this one's called structured input, and I love structured input so much. I think it's something that was out there for a little bit, kind of went away, and I'd love to kind of see the return of it. So it came out of a lot of the research from Bill Van Patten, around just input processing and just kind of the patterns that we notice of how learners are processing input. And what we kind of realized, and this is the kind of fancy schmancy side of things before we jump into what the activity looks like.
Yeah.
But we kind of realized that, like, hey, what we do a lot is like we give input, we have kids kind of working through it in their heads, and then we expect output at a certain point. But we never really, like some kid can process that input and make it into intake and have that ready to be outputted right away. And another kid, they're not ready for that. So like these activities, these structured input activities kind of target that middle zone, that developing system side of saying, let's do something while you're kind of processing to kind of help you get ready for some output. So it's kind of a targeted way. So let me try talking you through a lesson and then kind of maybe backtrack that way. Let's see how this might work. So this is one of my favorite examples to use. So I have no shame in my classroom whatsoever about the things I talk about. So like I'm notoriously known that I am not a healthy person, like at all. I don't like salads. At every moment in my life, I have at least 3 cakes in my freezer. I just love cake.
That's so great.
My students know it. Like we just accept it. Like health units are usually hysterical because like how to live a healthy life. Oh, I'm just walking irony at that point. Like, so we kind of play into that a little bit. So picture this scenario that says like, okay, like, so Senor had a really weird day yesterday. Read through each one of these statements and determine if this is something that he does every day or if this is something he did on his weird day. And so like the everyday activities would be like, so gets like 12 hours of sleep, avoids going to the gym, all things like that. And then the weird day activities said things like walked to work, ran in the park, prepared a salad. And so like we're usually getting a good laugh as we're going through all these sorts of things. But then if you take like a step back and actually think about it, what I'm trying to target there is goes to work, does this versus went here, ran in the park, which you'll never catch me running anywhere. So there's actually some hidden grammar within that. So what they're essentially doing in that activity, the way these structured input activities are set up, is you give some sort of context, some sort of reason for why you're reading something. And I'll talk about how this can be done with listening too in a second. But there's some sort of context of why you're reading, what these sentences mean. You list out a whole bunch of sentences where the words in those sentences are words that kids already know. Because if it's not a vocabulary lesson, it's a grammar lesson. So we want to make sure that there's no unfamiliar words, because otherwise that cognitive load is just too much. If I want them focusing on grammar, but there's so many new words, the brain wants to just figure out what the words mean, and they can't really do the activity. So they're classifying of saying like weird day, normal day, weird day, normal day, because they're processing the meaning of each one of those sentences. And so I chose those sentences really purposely because I want to kind of get down to this minute grammar point of the difference between like the he form in the present, the he form in the past. He did this versus he does this. And so with structured input, that's kind of what you end up doing is you choose this sort of minute grammar point that you want kids to kind of focus on, where you say like, I want you to notice the difference between these two particular things. I want you to notice the difference between the we form and the they form. And you write out some sentences where they're processing for meaning and they're figuring out, okay, based on how that word is kind of set up, I can tell which category that belongs in, which is helping them process of saying, oh, that's he goes, that's he went, that's he runs, that's he ran. And it's helping them process that whole idea of like meaning before form. So it's a way of kind of setting up sentences. And it's one of those things, the more examples you see, the more you kind of understand what you're looking for out of it. And so the big thing with it is you write these sentences and then you have them do something with them afterwards. Depending on where you are in the unit, and this isn't like pure from the research, it's kind of like the Mike Travers-isms of it. But depending on where you are in the unit, like in the beginning of the unit where it's more input based, you're probably going to have them say, like you might have them then say, okay, rank those activities in order of most healthy to least healthy. So they're not really producing language, they're still processing it. But at the end of, or mid or end of the unit, I might say, what are 3 more things you think Senor normally does every day? And what are 3 more things that he probably did on that weird day? Use those patterns that you just read in those sentences above to help you figure out how should I make those verbs kind of look.
Fantastic. So, and it does sound complicated, but it's not when you actually see it. And I think it is important to kind of do you have a blog post on this as well
Oh, I've
written?
got
Okay.
all,
So
I
there's
think I even have a step-by-step
I was going to
infographic of
say,
how to do it.
I thought so too. Actually, I remember your infographics and then the video on YouTube too. And I think what you realize is it is like a little formula. So, I mean, like it sounds like, oh, I've got to try and figure this out every time, but that's not really the case.
Yeah.
It is pretty, kind of structured the way it's laid out. What I love about it is it really gets to that concept idea too, that can be hard to do. And to really that even in English, I have an issue with concepts as far as like, oh, ran and run. Do I know the technical grammatical reasons of why I say ran and run? Only after I think about it a long time, right? But I just do it. So they're just kind of doing it naturally, and then they're thinking about it afterwards.
Yeah.
But it really does get to that concept piece, I think is
Exactly.
really, it's
And the
really
biggest,
good for that.
yeah. And the sort of biggest things to kind of always keep in mind as I was kind of learning this is a couple of cool things about the way you do these activities too that are important. So like one of the first things that was kind of a big mind-blowing moment for me was when you write your sentences. I think of how often I used to do this, where every time I would write the sentence that would say like, yesterday he went to the park, what word in that sentence actually what word in that sentence actually tells kids like this was a past tense action? Yesterday. They don't need the verb. Who cares what the verb looks like, right? And so like those words like yesterday or tomorrow to indicate future, or even putting subject pronouns before verbs, like that kind of gets rid of, there's this idea called the first noun principle, right? Where you're just kind of looking at the first word, you process the first word first, the last word second, everything else in the middle, nobody cares. And so often that's where my verbs used to be. And that's like an important idea, is thinking about the first word is that verb, because that's what I want them to process. I want them processing the meaning of that word and what meaning that actually has, which I thought was such a good mind shift for me, because I think about it when I'm talking. So sometimes in class, I'll purposely try to because in Spanish, you can get rid of subject pronouns. I'll try to get rid of that so that all they're kind of focusing on is like, who's the person being talked about in that sentence? Or I'll try to get rid of like time markers, like who's the person that's there.
That is brilliant, honestly, just because it's so funny you said that, because as I was doing that, I was writing down like, oh, with pronouns, because you're right. The minute I say yo something, they know I'm talking about myself, or if I say he something. But in real life, we don't go around necessarily in Spanish, we don't go around saying those pronouns. They're implied in the verb. So that's where a lot of confusion can happen as well, right? So over reliance on those kind of trigger words, that's really interesting, and that's something I'd never really thought about at all.
Same,
before,
right?
Until I kind of came across this idea of the structured input, and that first word being so important. So be really thoughtful and intentional about how you arrange that. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
The other thing I really like about this is that I love that, like you said, you're using you and your students in the context of your classroom as kind of the reason why you're talking. And so like that, them getting to know you and that community building and having some fun with it, I think is, I don't know how many times my grammar lessons were infused with any fun whatsoever, so probably, not, maybe it's for me, but not for anybody else. So I love that part of it too. You can make these very personal. And
and I love to have them match with the unit. So like I would do that like during a health unit, like make sure it actually kind of fits there. Like there's so many fun scenarios you can make with these things that I really love. Like with listening, my favorite one to do for listening is my scenario says like, you're sitting at Starbucks and you overhear a conversation between the person next to you and they're on the phone. You're like, well, obviously I'm going to listen in for the chisme. I got to get all the gossip. What are they talking about? But what I'm actually having them do is figure out like, okay, is that person talking about something they did yesterday or that they're going to do tomorrow? They think they're just listening to gossip, but the reality is like, there's actually something behind it.
Oh, that is a lot of fun. I really, really, really like that one. And I think that's one that I agree with you that can really make a difference in how you think about it. Here's my question that I know there's some teachers out there that may be asking. And that is, okay, so if I'm only doing the first person, or the first person and the second person of the verb or whatever it is, but what about the other forms? What, don't I need to give them all of them right now all together? It's just easier when you give them a chart that has the 6 different, boxes filled in. What do you say to that? Like, do you have an answer for that?
Oh, I definitely do.
Oh, good.
The first thing I like to think of is like, I mean, it all comes back to that idea of why, right? So I think of like, okay, what's the assessment I'm going to have my kids do at the end of this unit? I like to do this thing. I think it's from Cult of Pedagogy. It's called dog fooding, which I don't love that term, but it really just, it's,
Tell me more.
yes, right? It's basically have somebody else take your assessment and take that language and figure out, okay, this is what this person needed to do this task. This is probably what my kids need to do the task. And I have yet to either take or write an assessment where I'm talking about myself. I'm asking questions to you. I'm talking about he, she, non-binary, they. I'm talking about we. I went to Spain in the middle of it and talked to y'all. And
Right.
like, I've yet to ever have a prompt where I need all of those forms. I've had prompts where I've needed like up to like maybe 3 of them, right? And so I pick and choose really intentionally which ones I'm going to focus on. And I look at like the grand scheme of my year. So like I think of like, for example, like so in level 3, like we think of like the preterite, which is like this like redonkulous thing, right? So like I kind of the first go at it, the first time that they see it, they really only need like the I form, they need the we form, and some of them want like the he or she or they non-binary forms. That's what I'll focus on, and I'll call it my tier 1.
Mm-hmm.
Like curriculum brain, in my like in the back of my curriculum brain, I know that the they form is going to come up when we do this next unit or in a couple of units. Like I know it's going to be there. It's just kind of thinking about it in like a bigger picture of like it belongs here because they need it to do this thing. It doesn't belong here because that's me just kind of fitting it in. But at the same time, like some people really, really want the chart. If that makes you feel better, go for it. You do you. Like nobody's ever been damaged by the chart. At least not that I know of.
Right.
But it's there. But realistically,
Yeah.
what they need is this or that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to look at it. And I was probably the kid that would have begged for the chart. Honestly, that made sense to me to kind of put it in a very rigid sort of box. Whether it helped me in the long run, I can't say. But again, it's not going to hurt anybody. And if that's the hill you're going to die on, because it is, I think there is some, it is a little scary to think, well, if I only give them these forms of the verb, if you don't have it planned out, you're, in a really intentional way, yeah, there could be sort of gaps. But the other thing I found, or I believe to be true, is once they understand the concept that, oh, it's different if I say something than whether I'm asking you something. When you introduce, it's also different when I say they, it doesn't phase them as much because they already understand the concept that of all of this. And so then it's just like, oh, okay, it's just like that one. Okay, we can now I'm learning just the form on the end.
Yeah.
I don't
Basically,
have to relearn the concept, right? I already understand the concept. So I think that's really powerful as well. So
yeah, that just the idea that like basically what we're doing is we're trying to say those letters have meaning and they mean different things depending on when you're talking, who's talking, those sorts of things. And, and we don't want to like overwhelm them with all of it at once because then it's way more for the brain to process versus like, okay, I can do I and you, and just kind of getting really, really good at that. And then when you introduce that next form, it's already there. They're like, oh.
Yeah.
And as you kind of introduce like more and more tenses as like students grow in their proficiency, it's just so interesting to see them be like, oh, that probably ends in an S because that tends to be what happens here. That probably ends in an N because that's like I've seen that in other they forms. And that's when they get the concept. They get those sorts of ideas and they're applying it to new things. Like I just saw that last week I just had done a discovery lesson with Present Perfect. And kids were able, like, even though the context of what they were reading didn't have every form, they could kind of piece together, probably is this.
Yeah, because again, they're going to see patterns now, not just between, some things they can apply those patterns to other circumstances as well. So I think that's awesome. So how do you feel that changing to this different way of, this different relationship with grammar has really benefited, or what have you seen in your classroom for your students?
So it's just so interesting because what I see is just more, it's more of a focus on just them wanting to use the language more than they ever had before. Before it used to be just these sort of controlled and contrived sort of scenarios of using things. And now they just have so much at their disposal, and they're more open to things. They're more open to trying out new things. They're more open to recycling back to previous grammar. And it kind of changes the way just that they view language class. Because I think before they used to view language class, we could have called it Spanish class, but it was really verb class. And they used to view it as just, what's the next verb we're going to learn today? What's the next tense we're going to learn today? Which kind of probably equated with them going to one of their other classes where it's like, okay, I learned the next chapter in the biology book. I learned the next historical event in this class. Mm-hmm. And now it's more of a we're talking about things. We're using this grammar to kind of support it a little bit. But they're not leaving thinking, I learned this grammar. They're leaving learning about this culture, using this set of vocabulary, using this grammar to kind of do and complete things that they probably, I don't think they could have done before, which is just so cool to see.
I think that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for is there anything else, by the way? Is there anything else you wanted to talk about as far as grammar that we didn't already yet?
I think the biggest thing with grammar is just, again, judgment-free zone. Always have the judgment-free zone with yourself where you're I did what I could before, and I'm going to do what I can now. I always kind of refer to it as an onion, where it's kind of goes back to Shrek. I love Shrek. But it's ogres are like onions, but grammar is kind of like an onion.
Grammar is like an onion. I like that.
You're peeling back layers. Somebody today might have, after listening to this, might have peeled back one layer and been I get what grammar as a concept is. Some people might peel back 4 layers and change their entire lesson plan for tomorrow because they like something. And, there's some tears involved. It's just like cutting an onion. There's going to be some tears involved, but you just keep peeling back. You just keep trying to discover this next piece. And I find myself always trying to learn new stuff. Always, I'm always finding a new book, learning something new, trying to add something, trying to rethink about it, just because the goal is communication. And I want it to kind of be a really good match in my classroom. So that's kind of my mentality is it doesn't have to be all at once, because jumping all the way in, guaranteed tears. Yeah. But peeling back what you can. Really...
I think that's so funny because Rebecca Blue, one of the things she said was that she did jump. I talked to some people, and some people are nope, I found this out and I jumped all in whether I was ready or not. Right. And I probably should have not. And other people are going to take it a little bit slower, or even if you're just sitting there just processing your relationship with grammar and deciding if you're ready to take it to the next level or not, right? It just kind of depends where you're at, and it's all a process, it's all a journey, right? And so I appreciate you sharing your journey and what you've learned about this with me and with the listeners. And hopefully, we'll send some people your way as far as to your blog and to your wonderful videos that really, you really do have a great way of talking about it that's very accessible, which I think is what we need. Not super jargony, really real examples of this is what it looks like. And so I think that's really important. So I do encourage everybody to check that out. And I just want to say thank you. It's been such a pleasure talking with you today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And clearly, in case it hasn't been obvious, I love talking about this. So anytime, anywhere, I'm always down for it.
Awesome. So you can talk to Mike Travers about grammar anytime, anywhere you see him. And I have seen you all around the conference circuit, and you're on, I believe, Twitter and all that, right? So people can reach out if they need to have a grammar conversation.
We'll have to sit down.
Grammar lovers need to stick together, right? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Have a great evening.
Awesome. Thank you so much.